Your father might have guarded them, or maybe he watched them march through his hometown on the way to the fields. Perhaps he sold them cigarettes at the camp canteen, or sat next to them at a church Christmas dinner in 1943. If your father lived anywhere in America during World War II, there's a good chance he encountered something that most Americans have completely forgotten: the nearly 400,000 German and Italian prisoners of war who lived and worked on American soil while the war still raged. This is the story of what happened when Nazi Germany's finest soldiers, the veterans of Rommel's legendary Africa Corps, stepped off trains into the heart of America and discovered that everything they had been told was a lie. It's the story of how abundance became a weapon, how kindness became propaganda, and how the simple act of leaving the lights on at night helped win a war that was still being fought thousands of miles away. But more than that, this is the story of a transformation so complete, so profound, that it helped rebuild a shattered continent after the guns fell silent. The men who arrived as enemies left as ambassadors. The soldiers who came believing in German superiority departed knowing the truth about American power. And the lessons they learned in places like Camp Hearn, Texas, and Fort Robinson, Nebraska, would shape the democratic Germany that became America's closest ally. If your father was part of this story, either as a guard, a farmer who employed prisoner labor, or simply a citizen who watched these strange events unfold in his hometown, then you're about to understand something he witnessed that changed the course of history. This is the secret weapon America never talked about: the psychological demolition of Nazi ideology through the simple, overwhelming display of what a free society could achieve. June 4, 1943. A passenger train rolled through the darkness of rural Texas, its windows filled with faces that had no business being there. 1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps, men who had driven the British back to Egypt, who had earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself, pressed against the glass and witnessed something impossible: electric lights. Not just in the cities, but everywhere. Every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window blazed with illumination at 10 o'clock at night. An endless constellation of electricity stretching across the Texas plains as far as they could see. One prisoner, an officer named Werner Burkhardt, pulled out a hidden diary and wrote words that would have earned him solitary confinement if his own officers had discovered them. "The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts." But the Americans weren't lying, and that simple fact, that electricity flowed like water to every corner of this vast country, would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had described as a decadent, collapsed America controlled by Jews and mongrels, ordinary farmers had power that German generals envied. Your father, if he lived in Texas or Oklahoma or Nebraska in those years, would have seen these trains pass through. He might have been one of the curious townspeople who gathered at the depot in Mexia or Hearn or Scottsbluff to watch the enemy arrive. What he witnessed was the beginning of the most successful psychological operation in American history, though nobody called it that at the time. The prisoners had already received their first shock aboard the ships that brought them across the Atlantic. The Liberty ships that carried them were themselves monuments to American industrial capacity. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in California, a fact that would have been dismissed as impossible propaganda if the Germans had known it. These vessels, produced at a rate of 3 per day at the peak of production, were returning from delivering supplies to Europe. Rather than sail back empty, they carried human cargo. But the ships were only the beginning. The trains that met them at Norfolk weren't cattle cars or the 40 and 8 wagons that had carried German troops across Europe. They were Pullman coaches with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. One prisoner wrote that they boarded like tourists, not prisoners. An American sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly. Air conditioning in August. The prisoners had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma proved more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat could have been. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that couldn't exist according to everything they had been told. Every small town blazed with illumination: Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, parking lots full even at midnight. Your father, if he worked in one of those factories, might have looked up from his machine to see a train full of German prisoners passing by, their faces pale ovals in the darkness, staring at a world that shouldn't exist. One prisoner, Hans Müller, whose father was a Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered decades later, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Every one had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we would see." The camps themselves provided the next level of what American intelligence officers would later call cognitive demolition. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astounded the medical personnel among the prisoners. One German surgeon found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941. But it was the food that broke them first. The camp kitchen became a classroom in American prosperity. Walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. One former hotel chef from Munich assigned to cooking duties wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The American regulations require we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage." By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led to a decision that would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. German prisoners were trucked daily to work sites across the country, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything. Your father, if he was a farmer in those years, might have employed these men. The government paid him for their labor, and in return, prisoners worked his fields, harvested his crops, processed his grain. They arrived expecting to find the backward, depression-ravaged America of Nazi propaganda. Instead, they found mechanized agriculture that defied comprehension. At a cotton gin outside Houston, One prisoner watched a single machine process more cotton in an hour than his entire village could have handled in a month using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, the prisoner recorded. Not aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including the Negroes, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week, and this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields, witnessing agricultural mechanization that no amount of German engineering had achieved. A single combine harvester, they learned, could do the work of 100 men. The fields stretched to the horizon, each one larger than entire German counties. The farmers spoke casually of yields that would have been fantasy in Germany. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on the best land. One prisoner working on a farm outside Scottsbluff wrote, "The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father had earned in his lifetime. When I mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better." The most devastating revelations came to those prisoners who worked near American factories. While Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work, prisoners could work in industries that freed American workers for military production. This technicality allowed thousands of German prisoners to witness American industrial capacity firsthand. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in a month. The facility operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, as most young workers were in the military. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels. One prisoner who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war documented the experience. Everything was automated: electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant gained glimpses of the automotive industry's conversion to war production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed more electricity daily than the entire city of Hamburg. One prisoner wrote, "We could see the parking lots, thousands of cars belonging to workers. Workers! In Germany, even our officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory workers drove to work. The guard told us many workers owned 2 cars, one for work, one for family use. We thought he was mocking us." Christmas 1943 provided the most profound psychological impact of all. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers just months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting. Your father, if he was part of a church congregation in those years, might have been among those who sent gifts or sang carols to these former enemies. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Hearn sent in homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory. One German officer, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies, yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power. The Christmas feast itself defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream, quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they were sick, unable to comprehend such resources being lavished on enemies. One wrote, "We ate like kings, better than German generals eat, better than party leaders." And this was not special. The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? The treatment went beyond holidays. Throughout their captivity, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than any material wealth: American humanity. When one prisoner's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When another's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany. To enemy civilians in a nation America was actively bombing. One prisoner summarized it perfectly. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime. They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. This distinction, which seemed like propaganda, proved genuine. They prepared us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. Prisoners who had been told Americans were cultureless barbarians discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, scientific research that led the world. One physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge with enemies. This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology." June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of the operation, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, demonstrated American organizational capacity beyond Nazi Germany's wildest dreams. Prisoners watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw the endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, the supply system that delivered 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight. One prisoner wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources." April 1945 brought the final revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to German prisoners. Many refused to believe it initially, claiming it was propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually letters from Germany confirming the horror. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had maintained some pride in German honor despite military defeat now faced the complete moral collapse of their nation. One prisoner wrote the most eloquent summary, We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,000 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute. But they brought with them something precious: knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. The German prisoners who experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. Many rose to prominence in West Germany's reconstruction. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Kosciuszko, became president of the European Commission. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German prisoners held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families to show them where their transformation had begun. One former officer, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of what had happened. He said, "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. We saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence." The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies, united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. Your father witnessed something remarkable, whether he knew it at the time or not. If he guarded these prisoners, worked beside them, or simply watched them pass through his town, he was part of one of the most successful transformations in modern history, accomplished not through force, but through the overwhelming evidence of what free people could achieve when they worked together. The story of German prisoners in America is ultimately a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration, not through propaganda, but through prosperity, not through hatred, but through humanity. The German soldiers who witnessed American industrial might became unwitting ambassadors of democracy, carrying back to their homeland the seeds of transformation that would bloom into one of history's most successful reconstructions. Of the 371,000 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. The children of former enemies became friends. The grandchildren became allies. The great-grandchildren grew up in a world where German-American friendship seemed so natural that few remembered it had ever been otherwise. The trains that brought those prisoners to Texas in 1943 carried warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried architects of democracy. They had seen the future, and it worked. Their transformation laid the foundation for the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the peaceful, prosperous Europe that your father's generation made possible. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not military might, but the simple, overwhelming evidence of a free society's capacity to create abundance. The German prisoners were stunned by American industrial power, but ultimately they were converted by it. In their transformation lay the seeds of Europe's post-war redemption and the final defeat of the Nazi dream. Your father was part of that victory. Even if he never fired a shot, even if he never left American soil, he helped win the war by simply being American, by living in a country so confident in its power that it could show kindness to enemies, so secure in its abundance that it could feed prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers, and so committed to its ideals that it could transform warriors into democrats through the simple act of letting them see the truth. That was America's secret weapon. That was your father's legacy, and that is a story worth remembering.